Hi guys, we're back here with Ep.3 of Jewish Agnostics. We have Jon Papernick, and I'm Stephen Getz, as you know. How's it going?
And like Stephen said, today we have Jonathan Papernick, who I believe, if I'm reading your website correctly, you are the senior writer in residence in the Writing, Literature, and Publishing Department at Emerson College.
Yeah, that's correct. I'm a senior writer in residence. I'm not the only one. But I've been there for 16 years. I've been teaching fiction writing at Emerson in Boston for the last 16 years.
Okay, so just like to dive into it, what led to your shift in your belief of God, and can you just give a little bit of background of your belief of God, how like the active God plays a role in Judaism and how that combines into your belief system?
Yeah, let me give a little bit of background. First of all, so I'm an author, a fiction writer. I've published, my sixth book is coming out in April. It's a short story collection called The Gallery of the Disappeared Men. My first book came out 20 years ago, so before y'all were born, called The Ascent of Eli Israel. And it was set during the collapse of the Oslo Peace Accords in Jerusalem, where I lived in the 90s. And the stories are, I guess you can call them political nightmares and religious comedies. And to some degree, they all deal with faith in some degree. They're very dark stories, very disturbing stories. But I just went back to Jerusalem this fall, and just kind of walking the streets there, I realized those stories still ring true 20 years later. So that's a little background about me. As far as, my engagement with Judaism, I grew up in Toronto, Canada. I'm, I guess, a third-generation Canadian. Grew up Reformed, but always felt kind of disconnected from the religious aspect of it. And probably in my younger years when I was in high school, I, to some degree, might have even been a self-loathing Jew to some degree. I felt a sense of shame. I did have a bar mitzvah, and many of my closest friends were Jewish. But I don't know, I felt to some degree that I was, being Jewish wasn't a good thing to be. And luckily, that changed in my early 20s when I went to Israel for the first time, and I suddenly kind of realized I was part of this great tradition, and that I can travel halfway around the world and run into people that are very familiar to me. They felt like relatives. So, I kind of found my own way after trying to kind of, walk away a little bit, because I just I felt like if I didn't believe in all the things that Jews believed in, why should people hate me for those things? But obviously, as we mature, things change and our views change, and that happens to me, and I'm still evolving.
How would you say like that transformative experiment impacted like your view and your perception of faith?
Well, I think going to Israel in my early 20s was the most important, thing that's ever happened in my life. I guess you don't want to walk around being ashamed of who you are. And again, I kind of got a sense of pride in being Jewish. And, I just started to get a better understanding of where I came from, where we came from, and kind of engaging with faith. I spent a little brief amount of time at a yeshiva, actually, in Jerusalem when I was there in the 90s. And part of the reason I went there was I could stay for free in the old city of Jerusalem, and they would feed me, and the typical 22-year-old. But I went to classes there, and, I was a little more, I gave a little more pushback than some people. Before I'd gone to Israel, my father said, I'm afraid you're going to go there and you're going to marry a widow with 6 kids, and you're going to become religious. And because he said he'd known a guy who'd done that. And that wasn't something I was interested in. But, one time in the yeshiva, they were giving a lecture on the 5 levels of faith. The different why Judaism is superior to Christianity, because Christianity is based on faith, whereas Judaism is based on knowledge. For example, our forefathers were at Mount Sinai, and they told their children, would your parents lie to you about that? And then a couple days later, they gave a lecture on God, and 5 reasons that we know there was God, and all of them were faith. And I remember, speaking to the Rosh Yeshiva, the teacher, the head of the yeshiva, and I said to him, that's faith. You've undercut your entire argument. And he got very upset and called me into his office afterwards and said, here's a plane ticket. I want you to change your flight, give us a year to study Torah, and stay here. I think you've got leadership ability, leadership qualities. I didn't do that. I went home and finished university because I kind of took a year off in the middle. But I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed. I would have learned a lot. There may be a fanatic inside of me. I don't know. I don't know if I could have dealt with it in a healthy way or not. But it was interesting, and it did really kind of create the backbone of my first few books, kind of engaging with religion in those ways. And many of my stories have rabbis in them. Even though my rabbinic education I would describe as the research I did for my short stories and my novels. So that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah. I think you're muted.
Okay. So, in your story, you mentioned at some point how, you tried creating like a difference between Christianity and Judaism, saying that Christianity is faith-based while Judaism is based on knowledge, and you really came to the conclusion that, hey, at some level, they're all based on faith. So, do you think all religions are just based on faith, or do you have any?
No, I think so. I don't remember who said it, if it was Mark Twain or somebody else, somebody smarter than me, but the idea was, if there was no God, then humans would create a God. And I kind of think that's what's been done to kind of explain the unexplainable. But that doesn't invalidate Judaism, the fact that it's faith, and maybe I don't necessarily believe in the faith. It's the fact that we're part of a tradition. So if I go to Shabbat services, Jews all over the world are doing it, but it's also something my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, etc., have always done, following the similar traditions, reading from the same holy book. So whether you believe what's in the Torah, the fact that we, for thousands of years, have used that to guide us is powerful in its own right.
So, the power of it comes from the culture that has been developed out of Judaism rather than the religious text itself?
Well, a combination of both. I mean, I'm not saying there's there's a lot of wisdom in those texts, but some of the miracles that had happened. I mean, we can look at. I'm a fiction writer, so I can understand them and accept them metaphorically as opposed to literally. That's one way to look at those types of things.
Given that, sorry, I did not mean to interrupt.
That's okay.
Given that, you kind of looking at Judaism from a cultural side rather than a faith-based side because of that, unknowingness of the act of God, do you think following the culture, following the traditions, going to Shabbat services is different? Do you feel differently about it? And is it harder to follow, harder to uphold because you don't necessarily believe in that act of God?
Well, that's a really good question. So I just came back I spent 5 weeks in Israel this fall, and I had a great time. I always feel more myself, my most maximized version of myself in Israel. But I noticed two things. I went down to the Western Wall, and there was a bunch of Hasidic people kind of dancing around in circles and singing and dancing and having the best time. And I watched it, and it was interesting, and I thought, well, I've never felt anything like that. And then on my last day in Israel, it was Simchat Torah, and I went to a Reform synagogue in Tel Aviv where a couple of my friends belong, and they were being honored there. So they were carrying around the Torahs and stuff like that. And I've never seen them so happy as I've ever seen them in my life, carrying on the Torahs and just having such joy. And again, I thought, I just don't feel that level of joy. So when I came back, I went to see my rabbi, because I recently moved to Rhode Island, and the first thing I did was join a synagogue, because I think it's important to be connected to the community. And I went out for coffee with my rabbi, and I said, I don't feel anything. I go to services sometimes, and I don't really feel anything. And I want to know why. I wish I could feel something. She didn't really have an answer for it, but I think the idea might be to, if it's important enough to me, to do it more, to dig deeper into it, perhaps. But I went to Friday night services 2 weeks ago, and I was like, okay, I'm here. It's fine. but there wasn't any kind of deeper meaning. But on the other hand, I was in a room full of Jews in a time when anti-Semitism was on the rise, and just doing that alone in the communal manner of doing the things that we've done traditionally for thousands of years, while anti-Semitism is on the rise, and kind of staking a claim that I'm Jewish and I'm doing this is powerful in its own right.
Why do you think you continue to go to these Shabbat services? Why do you join the synagogue? Why is it the first thing you do if you don't necessarily feel anything from it? Like, what is the positive reinforcement that keeps you trudging?
Well, I don't go very often. I lived in Boston for the last 17 or 18 years, and I belonged briefly to a couple synagogues, and it just didn't ever really work for me. But I'm moving to a new city. It's a small city, and part of it was just community. We're interested in similar things, and and I'm still trying to figure that out. I mean, that's the thing. You can continue growing till the day you die. So maybe one day, maybe if you interview me 10 years from now, I'll be able to explain how I got to the point where I really do feel something. You know what I mean? But it just felt like the right thing to do on that Friday night. I wanted to be around other Jewish people instead of sitting on my couch drinking and watching TV. And it wasn't a bad experience at all. It wasn't an amazing experience. But again, it was an important thing, and I want to keep trying to kind of find ways to do it.
So that connection to Judaism, do you think it's a very individual thing where, you yourself, you need to find your own path to become more connected? Or do you think there's almost certain universal steps that one can take to become more connected?
Well, the nice thing about Judaism, it's not just a religion or a culture of people. So you can be very connected as a Jew if you never go to synagogue as well. Again, you're around people that have come from similar places and speak the same language. And I don't mean that literally, but I mean figuratively. They speak the same language. I mean, Jews live pretty separately from Christian culture for about 2,000 years, and it formed Jews psychologically. So you can meet Jewish people you've never met before and still kind of understand the way they're engaging with you in a way that you might not from people in other cultures. Because we've had the same kinds of questions and concerns and fears and so forth.
Uh-huh. And going back on that faith, why do you think other people believe in God? Given that Mark Twain or other unknown quote, why do you think humans need to create a deity?
Well, because I think life is full of mysteries. I mean, just like a serious question. It's 4:00 in the morning and you're smoking a joint on your couch and you're like, how did we get here? Who are we? Right? That's a serious question, and religion tries to answer some of those questions. But it also is kind of a code. I mean, if I do believe in God in any way, I mean, as a creator, I definitely don't believe there's a God who's guiding us. You can pray and say, I hope the Buccaneers win today, because God likes Tom Brady better than the other guy, right? So I don't believe in that, but the idea of some being or some energy that's the creator, you can kind of look at that and say, kind of engage with that sort of idea, because it's an ineffable question. You can't really come to an answer. Nobody can really know what it means. But I do think that if there is a God, there is a sort of sense of values that we all have in sense on ourselves. The average person could not kill somebody. Nobody can kill somebody and not feel bad about it. The people who don't feel bad about it are sociopaths, psychopaths, stealing from somebody, or some of the various codes that are found in the Ten Commandments. If a normal person will feel terrible if they do that. I believe that if there is some kind of God, it is imprinted upon our DNA, and the ones who are sociopaths and psychopaths are outside of life. But a normal person knows right and wrong. And so that's, I think, the Torah and things like that are kind of expanded upon the normal human code of conduct that many of us have.
So that's actually very interesting because so recently I read a book by so he's an Israeli professor of history. His name's Yuval Noah Harari. So he wrote a book called Sapiens, and in it he tackles the question of religion, and he says that it's used as a tool so that people, massive amounts of people, can all coordinate and work together as a society. Like, we need to believe in something, otherwise we're just going to be disunified. So would it be similar to like that, what you're saying?
Like an abstract
Yes and
government?
no. We definitely do need to believe in something, sure. But I think there's something beyond, kind of communal things. Like, as I said, a person who's not a sociopath or a psychopath knows what's right and wrong, I believe. That's like embedded into our DNA. So that's God, if there's a God, you know what I mean? Because it's something I think that goes through all societies. And so, like, obviously the Hitlers of the world are psychopaths. Donald Trump is a sociopath, you know what I mean? Like, these are different kinds of people that don't seem to engage with that. But, 90+% of the population, I believe, knows they have this inner guiding light that tells them right and wrong.
So, not that right or wrong. So, do you think that religion should play any influence in politics at all? Like certain laws being based on religious principles? Or...
Well, not in America, because America is supposed to be a country that is a secular country in that way. And again, like right now, there's the overturning of Roe versus Wade, where the idea is that abortion is legal and wrong, but that's not the way Jewish people see it. So that infringes on Jewish people's rights. So we may end up seeing cases in the Supreme Court with Jewish people as being like, I have a right to an abortion because of my religion. So, the whole American system is not supposed to be based on faith and religion. Other countries do have their societies kind of based on that. But that's not what America is supposed to be about.
But given that, like, America is kind of like... So the influence is there regardless. I think we wanted to say, because, like, for example, when you say, like, the Star Spangled Banner or, like, any chant, I mean, it's like in one God individual. I mean, you're like there, and then when the president takes the oath, they take it with the Bible. Same with the Supreme Court justices. And given that, like, religious, even though it's tradition, those are religious values instilled in law, which in America, as you said, is supposed to become purely secular. Do you think those traditions should change? And do you think, like, when choosing Supreme Court justices or other judges around the world, they should take into account their involvement in religion to make sure that they're not too religiously involved that would sway their judicial decision?
Well, let's go back to the first part of that question. I think it's not a matter of whether it should change or shouldn't change. I think it's always going to be a push and pull. And I think a healthy society is constantly in dialogue, so there's a push and pull both ways. So it works as it is now if there's allowed to be a push and pull from both sides. A constant dialogue, constant reinventing a discussion. So as far as that, I think it's fine. But we, in a free society with the First Amendment, are able to keep going back and forth on that. As far as the Supreme Court, the last three justices were all put on with a certain litmus test that the Federalist Society put into place, saying that they would overturn Roe versus Wade. That was their guiding light. And they come from a more religious background, especially, all three of them do, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Coney Barrett. So, I don't know, it's weird. There used to be 3 or 4 Jewish justices on the Supreme Court, but I don't know if they wore their Judaism on their lapels where everybody could see it, whereas these 3 are coming out as Christians. Do you know what I mean? So there's something different. We'll probably never, ever see more than 1 or 2 Jews in the Supreme Court at a time ever again. I think those days have passed.
So you talked about that tug and pull between, secularism and religious values in the government. So do you think that's better than, the extremes where, on one end, all religion, no secularism like Saudi Arabia, then on the other end, maybe you have something like the USSR, which was, you could argue it was a religion, but, very godless in its actions.
Well, no, obviously I don't think extremes are healthy. And America's trying to go on that middle ground. I still think America's tending more towards extremes right now. I think places like Canada, Australia, and a lot of northern European countries are definitely much more moderate right now, I think. I'm seeing a lot of extremism in America right now. The fact that there are a number of justices on there that want to put their finger on the scale for what they believe in, even though it's against the will of the majority. I mean, about 70% of the country is pro Roe versus Wade. They didn't want Roe to be overturned. So, we're seeing sort of a tyranny of the minority right now, which can be dangerous. So, I don't think extreme societies are healthy. Obviously, Saudi Arabia is an unhealthy society. Obviously, the Soviet Union was deeply unhealthy. And it was a godless society, but it was completely replaced with communism, which was God under different names. It was the same kind of way of dealing with things. Do you know what I mean?
Do you think the extremism in America, given the power of the minorities, was caused in part by religious values instilled at youth and other times?
I think religious value. There's a lot of things. The whole myth of this country, how it kind of came together. This kind of rugged individualism, hyper selfishness. I don't believe that America is simply a capitalist society. I think America is an uber-capitalist society because it doesn't have any of the healthy balances of aspects of socialism that you might see in other capitalist societies where people are taken care of with socialized medicine. That's a healthy thing for people. Or subsidized university and colleges, things like that. So we're an uber-capitalist society, which is quite extreme in its own right. But there's a kind of a selfish thread here. But I think one of the most dangerous things is the religious adherence to the Second Amendment, is that people feel that they have such a right to carry weapons to well beyond what the founders ever intended, I believe. I mean, back then it would take you you can load a musket and then fire a bullet every minute. Now you can walk into a school with an AR-15 and kill 100 people in seconds. It's terrifying. I don't think that was ever the intention. I'm sure you're aware of Kyle Rittenhouse, the guy who killed a couple of people, protesters in Wisconsin, crossing state lines. If you're on Twitter, he's posting a lot on Twitter. He's lionized by certain people. But nothing can take away the fact that he's killed two people, whether you believe he was defending himself or not. It's not something to be celebrated. He killed two people. And that's really dark. So I think a lot of the extremism comes from the rugged individualism, the selfishness, the belief that Americans have a certain special mission, kind of ties in with manifest destiny. If you look back to the founding of this country and how the Native Americans were wiped out, and how every treaty that they ever had was breached and broken. It makes me sick to think about. We talk a lot about what happened during slavery, but we talk very little about what happened to the Native Americans over here beforehand. And there's never really been a reckoning with that, and it's sickening. I grew up, in Canada, but I watched a lot of American television, and I grew up with Schoolhouse Rock, and they talked about manifest destiny, kind of moving the Indians out, and that's sick propaganda that it took me almost 50 years to realize I was being given this sickening propaganda. It's really messed up. So, this country's built on the death, the genocide of Native Americans, on the I don't even know what you would call it, what happened to the African beyond slavery, because it went beyond slavery, but the horrific mistreatment of that. And then even the working class in this country are treated terribly. To this day, right now we have this whole oligarchy of these billionaires, like Elon Musk, who's just running roughshod right now on Twitter. Again, I don't know if you're following that, but it's extremely dangerous. They use the word oligarchs in Russia, but we have oligarchs here too, and they're very dangerous. Donald Trump is another oligarch. Elon Musk is. And they're not all evil. Some try to do good work. What's his name? Mark Cuban. You know Mark Cuban?
Yeah.
Dallas Mavericks owner. Well, he's also created a new pharmaceutical. Yeah, so I actually get my medications from that, and it's so much cheaper than that. He's going to build a big factory in Dallas where people can get generic medications really cheaply. So he'll mark it up, 2 or 3 times what it costs, as opposed to 700 or 800 times. So they'll still be able to make enough profit to keep going. So there's pardon me?
Bill and Melinda. You have like the Bill and Melinda Foundation, which also, do you think like, how do religious values tie in with all of this like entire mess? I know it's multifactorial, but
yeah.
Just like another thing to add on. So really, what I've been getting so far, you can't really get rid of religion in a society. You can never have because it's always replaced by something else.
The Soviet Union was still religion by a different name.
Yeah, no, the religion of communism.
yeah.
So while it's something that we can't get rid of, and this sort of leads back to Stephen's question, is there a way to have the positive aspects of religion, have only those incorporated in society, and have all the negative aspects, be replaced?
And the short answer, no, because your positive is not my positive. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's tens of millions of Americans who think it's very positive that a woman should not have the right to choose. But there's, for even more millions, tens of millions, it's not positive. So there's no clear definition of what's positive and what's negative. And these things change over time. I mean, 20 years ago, gay marriage was seen as a no-go. In Barack Obama's first term as president, he was not pro-gay marriage. And that's changed to the point where you had a number of Republican senators voting for this not defensive marriage, whatever it's called now, the Equality in Marriage Act. So that's evolving. So again, what's positive and what's negative depends on where you stand and what perspective you're on. In the same way that somebody asks, the whole idea that one man's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. You know what I mean? So, a lot of the people that founded the State of Israel are heroes in Israel, and I totally get that as someone who supported Israel. But to other people, they're terrorists. They're terrorists to the British. So you can't ever say only the good things are only the bad things, because we'll never agree on what the good things are and what the bad things are.
Yeah, and tying back into like the last question, because like I really like enjoy how I don't enjoy it, but I find it very interesting that you mentioned like the juxtaposition between the freedom fighters and terrorism, because I think that also like ties into religion, because although religion can be a moral conduct for some, it can also be a motivator to do painfully terrible things under justifications of God, Allah, religion, however you want to coin it. And I think that plays a role in also a lot of the destruction we see, especially in that Middle Eastern region. Yeah. So do you think the destruction that using the name God and religion covers and uses as justification, do you think that nullifies the other nations that use it as a moral conduct and engage in peace?
Well, I don't think that Islam and Judaism have to clash. I think it's a different thing. It's political Islam. It's using Islam as a political weapon in that way, because Islam in its own right does not have to disagree with Judaism and vice versa. There's no reason that Jews and Muslims can't get along, and they did for various times in history, especially in Spain. I was thinking, like, if you go to the West Bank, there was a guy who's, public enemy number one in Israel in the 90s. His name was Yehi Ayash, the engineer. He did a lot of suicide bombings. But if you were to go to the West Bank or Gaza, he would be considered a hero. They would have posters up of him, or I think they might even have things like trading cards, like baseball cards. So from our perspective, the guy's evil. But from the other perspective, they're saying this will bring us closer to what we want. Unfortunately, I think that's a misguided belief. I really think there could have been a healthy two-state solution without, politicians using religion on both sides to get in the way. I believe that Jews should be allowed to live in the West Bank, but the way it's been done with these kind of settlements and a more fanatical kind of settlement has made it into adversarial. But there's no reason that Jews shouldn't be allowed to live in Hebron when they've lived there for thousands of years. I don't believe it's occupied territory. I believe it's disputed territory. To say that a Jew can live anywhere in the world, but they can't live in Hebron. But yet the people who live there are the most extreme, and it leads to clashes and violence and this and that. So it's impossible to unravel this kind of mess, but it is a mess.
Yeah. Do you think, like, I was wording that question towards Judaism and Islam because that's, like, the obvious conflict, but I was also really wanted to, like, focus on many of the supposedly less obvious horrors in the world. Like, for example, you mentioned Native American slavery. They usually, I mean, the Spaniards in the South who used the Southern Native Americans, and the English, I mean, the colonists who went there were like evangelicalists. They went to study their own religion because they were persecuted in England. So many of these colonies, many of these like enslavements were used under the justification of God. They were enslaving Native Americans so that they can preach God's name. They were even like in slavery, like God gave them this right to enslave these African Americans. So like, even if it's Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, no matter what religion it is, it ends up being a justification for destruction. And do you think like that total destruction, given all the religion, like nullifies the peace that religion provides, the kind of balance it provides to our extreme individualistic society?
Well, if I was to say it does nullify it, would it matter? I mean, what was done in the name of religion was horrific. And, again, I've always been what I consider a secular person, even though almost all of my writing deals with religion in one way or another, which is an odd thing. I mean, as I said, I think my writing is my own rabbinic education, because maybe I'm not comfortable with like becoming religious. Who knows? Maybe I'd be a fanatic if I was religious. Like if I'd stayed at that yeshiva and got the black hat and the side curls. I mean, there's probably a fanatic in me, and I probably knew that. But I don't know if you can say one thing can nullify another, but there's no doubt that the use of what the Spaniards used with religion. I mean, look at the Inquisition, something I didn't know until much later in life. It didn't end until the 1800s. It started in 1492. It went on for hundreds of years, and it was carried over to Mexico and South America and things like that. Like that's horrific if you think about it. The damage that the Inquisition did is also like something we don't think much about. In high school, you probably learn about the Inquisition in a paragraph, a page on the Holocaust, 3 pages on slavery, 2 pages on Reconstruction. You know what I mean? So, like, it's everything's boiled down, and we're missing out on the texture of this. Like, I'm reading a book right now about the pogroms in Ukraine between 1918 and 1921, when over 100,000 Jews were murdered. And I'm reading that right now because there's such an upsurge in anti-Semitism right now, and I'm afraid that most people think that there was a Holocaust, nothing before, and nothing after. And, there was, Jews have been murdered all kinds of times. It wasn't just during that time, but in the 1880s in Russia, Jews were in the 1600s in Ukraine. Obviously, the Inquisition, the Crusades. Tons of Jews were murdered during the Crusades. So this has always been happening. The word ghetto comes from, in Venice, the Jews were shoved into these ghettos, 800, 900 years ago. That's where it comes from. So we're living in an ahistorical time where people can literally shout Kanye was right because they don't know anything. But they do know that it's okay to hate Jews because it's always been acceptable. How many Jews were murdered in Europe before the Americans even got involved in World War II? I know Roosevelt wanted to get involved, but the rest of his government didn't. So I don't even know where I'm going with this, except to say that there's some dark stuff that can be brought out by religion, and the Jews have been on the wrong end of a lot of things because there's fewer of us.
Yeah, and I think
that we're. Oh,
sorry. Yeah, you got this.
Just like a small question. So, as for the Jews, so you think they were persecuted solely because of the religious practices of their neighbors, and that led to their persecution, or they were persecuted because the Jews had their beliefs that were different from everyone else, and then that led to the persecution? You're different from me.
Well, I think a lot of the original conspiracy theories are all related to Jews. We're in an age right now when conspiracy theories are the order of the day among certain people. But the conspiracy theory that Jews killed Jesus is one. The conspiracy theory that Jews were well poisoners. There's a pretty clear reason for why that happened. The Jews kept their sewage away from their drinking water. Various things like that. So, a lot of anti-Semitism comes from conspiracy theories. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was a fake document that was a conspiracy theory. Jews using the blood libel, Jews using Christian blood for ritual purposes is an absurd conspiracy because, if you look at kosher meat, there's no blood at all in it. You know what I mean? So it's like Jews don't even want to deal with that shit. So now you have to put an explicit on the podcast. So yeah, I mean, it's people have always. I mean, Jews have been different. They've always been a minority community, and when there were large amounts of them, they were spread out enough that they couldn't organize. They spoke different languages. They dressed differently. They smelled differently. Jews ate garlic when other people weren't eating garlic. Jews smell like that. So it's just like a lot of stuff, and it's a historical continuum that is not ending. When I grew up, when I was your age, I thought we had already reached the end of history. I thought anti-Semitism was in the past. I thought racism was coming to an end. I really did believe that, but that's an absurd thought.
Mm-hmm. And I don't mean to play the devil's advocate, but I probably will. I don't even think it necessarily is just Judaism because a lot of the racism and other things around the world have also occurred with Judaism on obviously not the right side, but the opposing side, the one that dealt it. For example, a lot of the in Virginia, in the colonies, Jews made up probably 20% of the population. That was one of the big plantation regions where Jews owned numerous slaves, and they enslaved.
Are you sure that's true? Because I'm not aware of that fact. Are you sure it's true?
Yeah.
There was a prominent Floridian senator, and I forget his name, but he was a Sephardic Jew. I think was it Benjamin Judah something?
And I know that the Secretary of War during the Civil War was Judah P. Benjamin, who was Jewish.
Yeah, on the Confederacy side.
He was more complicated than that. He was quite a thinker as well. I mean, there's nuance.
Yeah, coined the brains of the Confederacy. But other than that, a lot of the bachelors, the ones who were in these colonies, enslaved African Americans. And I'm not saying I'm not.
Well, look, I do not believe the Jews are better people than other people. So yes, any atrocity that other people could do, Jews are equally as able to do that, because people are constantly in need of being reminded that they need to be better humans. But it doesn't take much to strip away the permissions to allow you to do horrific things, and then Jews are also capable of that. Sure.
Yeah, I think it's just important to understand that kind of no one is exempt from religion's impacts on destruction and influences, because as you can see, that's been a case for all groups, not just Jews.
No. There are groups of fanatics in Israel right now who young religious Jews who try and trash the Church of Dormition or Jacob's Tomb or go to various Palestinian villages and do things. It's not what Jews are supposed to do, but it is a thing that fanatical human beings do. Fanatics of all types are similar to each other. A Jewish fanatic is much more similar to a Muslim fanatic than they are to a suburban Jew or a suburban Muslim. Fanaticism binds itself with its own kind of connective tissue, and you see similarities across those, across all boundaries.
Do you think this? I understand that there is a push and a pull, but do you think at least in America, education will shift to more secular note? Do you think at some point there will be an edited Pledge of Allegiance where there is no individual under one God, where there is no necessarily allocated class for religious learning, kind of like a shift to the USSR policy, but obviously less extreme, at least even more extreme? Where do you think religion and education is going?
Well, in a short answer, no, it's not going to change. I don't think, because we think because we think a certain way that other people can't possibly believe that. And again, there are tens of millions of people that really kind of have their own certain way of looking at things, and we're in a divided country. It's almost more of a rural-urban divide right now, and the rural parts of this country are living in a completely different world. They watch different news, listen to different music, Many of them don't, just different kinds of things. So I don't think there's anything that suggests that will change. Right now, the liberal argument has been winning. I mean, the dominant cultural touchstones in this country are, for the most part, liberals. So you could go to, I don't know, a philharmonic or some kind of concert, and you may have somebody come out and speak out on behalf of Syrian refugees or something like that, or women's right to choose, because the cultural elites that the majority of the country engage with are of liberal mindset. So, but the other point of view is not letting that go. I think you see that with a lot of the election denial in 2020. I believe that when Barack Obama was elected, it put a lot of fear into people's minds that they were, quote, losing their country. It's funny, in the media you hear a lot of things like, well, in X number of years, this country will no longer have a white majority. But I find that whole concept offensive, as if that should mean anything at all. Yeah. Or when they would say, Barack Obama's a Muslim, and somebody would say, well, he's not a Muslim. But what people should have said was, he's not a Muslim, but what would it matter if he was a Muslim?
Why does it matter? What? Yeah.
Like, that always bothered me, what they did to him with that, the birth certificate stuff was just such a disgrace, and a lot of people to this day have a utterly visceral hatred to Barack Obama, who to me seems to be really super highly intelligent person, a kind person, a real thinker, an amazing person, and but yet there's a certain portion of the country who sees something completely different. So that kind of goes back a little bit to what you're saying, Stephen, about like whether we think we can kind of change the education. There's two different worlds, and there's always going to be people who see Obama as the devil. So they're never going to change their views on education and God either. Do you know what I mean? It's just,
but like over the course of decades, if not centuries, I mean, we saw this huge shift right now. You said yourself, Obama at the very beginning was not pro-gay marriage, but then later on, now even Republicans are.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, because gay marriage has come a long way. I mean, I remember during the Bush administration, even myself, someone talked to me about gay marriage. I said, well, what's wrong with the civil union? I didn't understand at the time. But, gay marriage makes all the sense in the world. And sometimes it's just a matter of getting used to the idea. Things do change, and maybe it'll happen so slowly we won't notice it. So, I'll tell you what. 100 years from now, you guys can come back and interview me again, and we'll see where it is. But yeah, things will change, and I can guarantee you they will not change the way that we expect them to change. We can't imagine what the future is going to be. That's the most amazing thing. You can look back through all eras and all the predictions. Like, you can look back at what the year 2000 is going to look like way back in the 50s, flying cars and stuff like that. We can't know. The only thing that exceeded expectations was like the iPhone. Smartphone is so cool. Like that's beyond anyone's imagination. The fact that it can have all my music on it, all my pictures on it. So we can't know what the future is going to be. So, maybe things will happen slowly, but I don't see any signs that'll be the case. But, I'm just me sitting here in my office. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I think that leads us to our last question. Oz, do you want to say it?
So just a question that we were both thinking about. It seems to be that you're almost an agnostic in a sense. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. But you're secular, you're in the middle almost. What would be one piece of advice that you'd give to agnostics, people that are unsure of their religious beliefs?
Or also I just want to piggyback on that, other people in your situation, given that I think it is kind of a strange and fascinating situation you're in, that you don't necessarily believe that there's an active God, but you still do enjoy, or even if you don't necessarily enjoy, you are interested in partaking in religious events and following culture and tradition. So if for other people like Oz and I, who maybe don't necessarily believe in an active God, what kind of lasting advice would you give them? Yeah, basically what is Oz.
This is easy. Don't be a dick. You don't be a dick. You believe what you believe, and you may or may not be right. It may change. and let other people have their thing. And as long as they're not pushing it on you, then it's fine. Like, you could talk among your friends if you're like, oh, that's dumb, but like, don't be a dick to them. Let them have their experience. Because believe me, when I was younger, I was a dick. You know, I really was. So don't be that. You know, if people want like going to church on a Sunday, that's fine. Let them do that. If they believe that Jesus is going to come back to life tomorrow, let them believe that. As long as they don't impose it on you. You know, your view is more of a kind of a wait and see kind of attitude. But you know, always try and be a better person. It's something I've been trying to do the last 5 or 6 years. You know, it takes work because it's easy to be an asshole to people. And it takes work to look inside and say, you know what, like, I want to be a good person and you know, let people have their own views and show curiosity to it. Like, if you meet people that have views you don't agree with, like, ask them questions. Like, hey, maybe that's why you're doing this podcast. Like, why do you believe this? Like, what does it do for you? Like, isn't it so interesting to hear other people talk? Like, other people are fascinating, especially people that believe things that are different than you. Well, that's what I think. Don't be a dick.
Great words of advice.
Great words. All right, I think we're...
yeah, with that, I mean, it's a great way to end the podcast.
Yeah.
Well, there's no more questions.
Thank you guys for watching. This has been episode 3. We'll film episode 4 sometime throughout the next month. Yeah, great. See you guys.
Definitely.